The United Nations has called it deplorable. The Palestinians have called it a massacre. In just the past 2 weeks, Israeli forces have killed over 30 Palestinians and injured more than 2,700 along the border between Israel and the occupied Gaza Strip, as tens of thousands of protesters gather to commemorate the Great March of Return. Multiple reports have cited unarmed Palestinian civilians, including journalists and children, being shot and even killed by Israeli snipers. But Israeli officials have insisted the protests are, quote, organized terrorist activity linked to Hamas. So, will Israel continue attacking civilians in the upcoming protests? Will the world do anything about it? And how significant of a role is Hamas really playing on the Palestinian side? Joining me to debate this from Los Angeles, Yusuf Munaya, Executive Director of the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights, and from Tel Aviv, Danny Ayalon, former Israeli Deputy Foreign Minister. Thank you both for joining me in the arena. Danny, let me start with you. The Israelis have killed more than 30 Palestinians over the last couple of weeks, including people who are unarmed, including teenagers, including a journalist wearing a press jacket saying press on it. Did they all deserve to die in your view?
Nobody deserves to die, Mary, but unfortunately what we see here that the Hamas is in a very, very barbaric way, I would say, really heinous war crimes, are using civilians as human shields, and they embed among them terrorists, snipers, some who carry explosive charges, and most of those that were killed were Hamas terrorists, and the responsibility is with Hamas. If they would just forget this war on Israel, recognize Israel, understand that we are there to stay, then I believe we can really do a lot of things together in a peaceful way.
Yusuf Munaya, most of the people who were killed were Hamas terrorists. Hamas is to blame, says Danny Ayalon.
Look, unfortunately, the Israelis think that you can shoot protesters on video and just scream Hamas at that, and suddenly that becomes okay. Unfortunately, that's not how it works, and we have seen lots of documented evidence on video of Palestinian protesters who were shot when they were in no way posing any imminent threat to life to anyone on the other side of the fence. So it's very clear here what is going on. Palestinians are protesting for their basic rights, rights which are systematically denied by Israel, including the right to free movement, where millions of people in Gaza are practically indiscriminately denied the right to ever leave by the state of Israel. And to enforce these policies, the Israeli state is willing to use brutal force, even to gun down unarmed protesters and members of the press who are wearing clearly marked identifiers. And I should say that it's not just the individual soldiers who need to be held to account for murders that have been taking place in front of the world to see, but the upper echelons of the Israeli state, which ordered army snipers, 100 of them, to go down to the fence along Gaza and to respond to protesters with lethal force. This is a criminal order, and the international community, I think, is very right to call this out and demand accountability for it.
Danny, do you believe the Israeli military has the right to shoot unarmed Palestinians at the border?
Well, I would say every country, every sovereign country has the right for self-defense. This is very much anchored in the UN Charter and international law. What we see here is a real flagrant violation.
I get that, but I specifically asked about unarmed protesters.
Unarmed protesters have not been shot. And again, I want to specify this here.
That's just demonstrably false.
I mean, I hear all this criminality. The criminality is Hamas.
It's documented
Israel, we have to remember.
Video.
I would ask you, why is Hamas killing its own people?
Don't ask me questions. Don't ask me questions. Just answer the simple question that was put to you. Why are soldiers in the Israeli army being ordered to shoot unarmed protesters?
Okay, let me ask you this, Danny. Let me go back to my original question,
Sure.
and then we'll ask Yusuf a question about Hamas.
Okay.
Unarmed protesters, you say Israel hasn't killed. We have seen on video people fleeing in the opposite direction with no weapons on them being shot. I've seen it myself. What do you say to people like me who have watched videos of people running away from the fence being shot by Israeli snipers? What's your response, just specifically on that?
Mehdi, I would say there is no business for them whatsoever to be by the fence. And they were warned, it's a war zone. You do not send individuals and civilians into war zone. And I can tell you, most of the people, if not all of them, were sent there and were forced there by Hamas. We also can see in the videos how Hamas terrorists are sending them. They wanted 1 million people march. They got only 20,000, and even those have been forced to do that. The issue of Gaza is much bigger than just this criminal march of the Hamas. It is that Israel left Gaza altogether 13 years ago, left infrastructure, greenhouses for the Gazans in the belief that peace can come through.
Yusuf, respond to that point that Israel left Gaza, and also deal with the point that these protests have been at least partly, if not fully, organized by Hamas, have they not? Even one of the journalist activists, Ahmed Abu Atima, says, yeah, we invited Hamas in to help us with logistics, with media coverage, with moral support. So deal with both of those points that Danny's raised.
Mehdi, I think it's quite revealing that in response to the question about why the Israelis are caught on video shooting unarmed protesters, the response that we get is that the protesters shouldn't be protesting, as if to justify the shooting of unarmed protesters. And I think your viewers can clearly see that this is an attempt to justify what is clearly murder. Palestinians have a right to protest. They have a right to protest anywhere that they want if they do so peacefully. And many of these protesters were gunned down on video while not posing any imminent threat to the life of the Israelis. It was Israeli soldiers that did this, not Hamas. It was Israeli soldiers acting on the orders of the Israeli government, not Hamas. You simply cannot keep blaming Palestinians every time you kill Palestinians. It's unacceptable. As far as whether or not the Israelis left Gaza, they routinely enter Gaza's airspace, its sea waters, and fire into Gaza anytime they want. Just because you don't swim in a fishbowl with your fish doesn't mean that you don't control its life. That's the way that Israel exercises its control over Gaza, and it's holding 2 million people there in captivity.
Danny, I must stick with this, the purpose of discussion, to talk about the deaths in Gaza. You keep saying they're terrorists, it's Hamas's fault. Forget the protesters for a moment. We had a journalist, Yasser Murtaja, who we all saw pictures of having been shot. He was wearing a press jacket, and he was shot by an Israeli sniper. What was his crime?
The crime may not be his. The crime is those who sent him there.
But you can't shoot someone to send a message to someone who may or may not have sent them. That's against the law, Danny.
Infiltrate.
You can't just shoot someone because you don't like who allegedly sent them.
What the Hamas terror organization does, Hamas uses human people as shields to shield their terrorists. Among all those who came unarmed, many were armed.
Danny, he was a journalist whose organization was vetted by the US. He was not standing in front of a Hamas terrorist. He was shot in cold blood. I mean, those are the facts.
Well, I want to say one thing. Israel, which is a clear democracy, and we have self-criticism and we check ourselves all the time. The army is going to do an investigation because they want to do after every operation and shooting. So this is being investigated without any, hiding anything.
Yusuf, Danny keeps making this point about Hamas, and obviously you disagree, you see it as a deflection, but just deal with the perception point here with Gaza. It is a problem, is it not, for the Palestinian movement, that whatever legitimate protests or struggles they may have, it is a problem that in a place like Gaza, Hamas rules Gaza, and that's always going to be kind of the shadow, that's always going to be the elephant in the room, as it were, that you have this group ruling Gaza, which is regarded as a terrorist organization by many governments in the West, which has a pretty horrific human rights record in Gaza. That's a problem, is it not? You would concede that.
Look, anytime you have people who are under occupation and struggling for their rights, and they are being gunned down in very criminal ways, we are going to hear all kinds of excuses to try to whitewash those shootings and that brutal repression of people rising up. And the use of this argument to try to deflect and excuse the killing of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip is disgraceful in my view. And unfortunately, this is something that has been used for a long time and will continue to be used and should not be accepted.
Danny Ayalon, obviously you don't think the Israeli military did anything wrong, but just from a perception point of view, for Israel's reputation, this last few weeks and the coming weeks, pretty bad. Surely you would concede that. You have human rights organizations lining up to point out that you're possibly committing war crimes. UN human rights officials are saying the same thing. Western journalists are going there and seeing this for themselves. The video footage is everywhere. And you have your defense minister saying nobody's innocent in Gaza and the troops should be commended for killing these people. That's not a good look for Israel, what you call a clear democracy. Surely you'd concede that much.
Absolutely. I would concede that much. The pictures are not very rosy, and certainly we do not like to see these pictures. But again, we have to see the broader context, and not any country in the world, including all those countries, Western democracies that criticize us, would not allow a stampede on their borders.
Well, those countries aren't occupying the lands on their borders, by the way.
Well, first of all, this is still under debate, the disputed areas. But with Gaza, certainly we left Gaza to the last inch. And I think Hamas, they try any provocation against us, and knowing that we will have to defend ourselves.
And just on a factual point, the UN says Gaza is still occupied. I know you said it's up for debate. Last word, Yusuf Munaya, what's going to happen in the next few weeks? These protests are going to continue. What do you see happening?
I think these protests are going to continue, and I think they're inspiring for Palestinians who are looking at mass popular mobilization as a way to continue to resist and demand their rights. I have a very simple message for Mr. Ayalon and the Israelis. If you don't like to see these images of Israeli soldiers shooting unarmed protesters and members of the press, you should simply stop shooting unarmed protesters and members of the press.
Yusuf Munaya, Danny Ayalon, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you both for joining me in the arena. That's our show. Up Front will be back later this year.